Hi guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. The illusion of changing wars. That's what I want to touch on in today's lecture. I think I've mentioned this in some of my previous videos before, but if you look at the general way in which the world looks at warfare and understands warfare, as I've often pointed out, there are a variety of opinions, and many of them are based on this whole idea that war is changing. So you can read journal articles about warfare from the 50s, from the 60s, from the 90s, from just 3 years ago, and the one commonality you will find in most of those analyses is this insistence that war is somehow changing. In fact, I would argue that you could even go back to the 17th and 18th centuries and you will still find military scholars, experts, for some reason insisting that the wars that they see with their eyes are fundamentally different from the wars that have preceded them. So this seems to be some kind of well-entrenched bias notion that most people have when they look at warfare. So in this video, we will look at some of these distinctions and why, in my judgment, they do not really qualify as accurate distinctions. In one of my previous videos, I had already touched on conventional and unconventional warfare, where I went into the differences between the two, but I also pointed out that the supposed unconventional warfares were not really unconventional in any sense. As a matter of fact, when we look at what's associated with this unconventional warfare, which is non-state actors waging war, a lack of organized armies, a blurring of the lines between who a civilian and who a soldier is. All of these things have existed for thousands of years. It's only from a very narrow, I don't want to use the term Eurocentric, but that's unfortunately the only term we have. Unless you apply a very narrow Eurocentric perspective on warfare, you will not arrive at such conclusions. And yet, because almost all military scholars in the world today have an extremely Westphalian, Eurocentric perspective, we see this mistake being prevalent in the discourse over and over and over again. So some of these things, that's the unconventional warfare thing. You also often hear of this new term called hybrid warfare, which is supposed to be a blurring of the lines and a mix of economic warfare and political warfare and things like that. And you see a lot of scholars sort of talk about it like it's some kind of new threat. But if you go back and read Sun Tzu, if you go back and read Kautilya, if you go back and read Machiavelli, even though Machiavelli is a lot more recent than Sun Tzu and Kautilya, but you could go back and read military thinkers of the classical age and you will see that all of them considered all of these different aspects to be a part of military strategy and to be a part of warfare as well. So it's only from the Prussian thinkers onwards. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, Prussian thinkers like Clausewitz, Jomini, all these guys, after the Napoleonic Wars, all these guys dominated military thinking, and their worldview, their analysis of military history and military theory is what passes off in today's world for military theory. So because we follow these guys, we unfortunately have an extremely narrow perspective, and we believe that things like political warfare and economic warfare are somehow new, are somehow different, because those guys back in those days thought that it was something different. The other thing is this idea of generational warfare, which I think we need to touch on as well. This was created by a former soldier called William Lind, and he came up with the idea that war can be split into generations, and it's a very, very popular idea today. It can be international relations, history, security studies. You look at many of these fields, and this idea of generational warfare is very popular. So the first generation of warfare was line and column tactics. The second generation warfare is sort of more firepower oriented, kind of like what we saw in the Civil War. The third generation of warfare is sort of maneuver based warfare like Blitzkrieg and all that we saw in World War II. And William Lind was arguing at that time that what we see today is fourth generation warfare. And today you find people saying we're in the fifth generation, we're in the sixth generation. I recently read an article saying what will eighth generation warfare look like. So all these distinctions are very popular, but once again extremely ahistorical. This whole notion that we are in the fourth or fifth or sixth or whatever generation of warfare once again makes sense only if you go with the Prussian view, or rather the Westphalian Eurocentric view, that history itself starts from 1647, from the Treaty of Westphalia. Because if you looked at the larger history of warfare and the larger history of armed conflict, there is no way you would call the line and column tactics of the 17th century first generation warfare, because anybody would be able to see that even that was a result of thousands of years of evolution. If anything, the first generation of warfare should be tribal warfare. Maybe the tribal warfare that we might have seen between the Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals. Who knows, right? So from a historical scientific sense, that should be the first generation. And we've got to start from there and keep breaking it down. Now, why is this important? Is it just semantics? Is it just me sort of criticizing these guys for the sake of it? No. I have no problem, as I've stated before, with Western scholars having this Western-centric perspective on history. Because, and in fact, I would argue that they are right to have that. The problem is that in this part of the world as well, we then swallow rather, that narrative hook, line and sinker. So recently the Pakistani army conducted workshops on how Pakistan needs to deal with sixth generation warfare. If you think about it, what does the whole notion of sixth generation warfare have to do with Pakistan? If you look at Pakistan's history, whether you want to start from prehistory and then India and then Pakistan, or even if you just wanted to look at history from 1947 onwards when Pakistan was born, this makes no sense. They are not in the sixth generation of anything, let alone warfare. They are either in the 100th or 200th generation of warfare, or they are in the second or third generation of warfare. And yet, simply because this is the Western-centric perspective, Pakistani military scholars kind of just, as I was saying earlier, swallow this hook, line and sinker. So that's the basic problem. Tell me what you think. Do you feel that this is just semantics, or do you feel that we need to have more accurate, historically representative terminology for the classification of warfare? If you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.